Hi everyone, Steven Marcus here, and for my project I decided to work on the 1919 Chicago Black Sox scandal, one of the most controversial scandals in professional baseball history. So as I was mapping this out in ArcGIS, what I found interesting and fascinating, of course, was how this incident, this scandal, was spread across multiple cities as it goes from Chicago to Boston to New York to Cincinnati, and then eventually it winds up back to Chicago. So looking at this scandal, what is the Black Sox scandal? The Black Sox scandal centered around the 1919 World Series between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds. Several White Sox players accepted money from gamblers in exchange for intentionally losing games during the series. The situation was complicated because the White Sox were not simply a bad team. They had won the World Series in 1917, two years previously, or 2 years prior, I guess you would say, and captured the American League pennant again in 1919. That made the allegations surrounding the World Series even more significant. Eventually, 8 players were implicated in the scandal, including Eddie Sicott and Shoeless Joe Jackson. The investigation eventually moved into the criminal courts, although all 8 players were acquitted in 1921. So why were they called the Black Sox, right? I thought they were called the Chicago White Sox. Well, one part of the story that I wanted to explain in my project, because it goes with this, was the nickname Black Sox. So the nickname actually existed before the 1919 scandal and was associated with complaints about the White Sox having dirty uniforms and owner Charles Comiskey's efforts to save money on laundering, or laundry, I guess you would say. Over time, though, the nickname became much more closely associated with the events of 1919. Comiskey also had a reputation for being difficult with his players, particularly when it comes to salaries and contracts. I think it is important to separate the background from what actually happened. Player dissatisfaction may have helped create an environment where some players were willing to listen to these gamblers, but it certainly does not excuse the decision to participate in fixing games. It's definitely prevalent in baseball coming this next year as well. So why baseball history? One of the biggest reasons I enjoyed this project is because I generally enjoy baseball. I've always been interested in the different parts of the game, not just what happens on the field, but the history behind the players, teams, owners, fans, and everything else surrounding baseball. This is also going to be a local topic to me, as I live probably about like 30 minutes outside of the city of Chicago. So what I find interesting about baseball history is that you can look at the game through so many different angles. There is the sport itself, but it is also the business, the money, the gambling side of things, labor, competition, and of course, American culture. The Black Sox scandal brings a lot of those different factors together in one story. And so while the story map was the format required for this assignment, the subject itself was something I was genuinely interested in researching that made this project a lot more enjoyable for me. So the story map format also gave me a different way to look at the scandal. Rather than just explaining the events in a paper, I could actually show how the story moved from one place to another. The scandal starts largely around Chicago and then moves to Boston and New York as players and gamblers became involved. It then moves to Cincinnati for the World Series before eventually returning to Chicago for the investigation, trial, and punishment. I think seeing these locations together makes it easier to understand that the Black Sox scandal wasn't one isolated event. It was a series of connected events involving different people and places. And here is a screenshot of my map right down here. I also have a link to my, my story map on this last slide, and I'll show it to you as we get there. So the first major part of the story map follows the conspiracy itself. The story map, or the story, begins with meetings involving White Sox players and gamblers in Boston and New York. From there, the players traveled to Cincinnati for the World Series, where their planning became action. One of the locations I found especially interesting was Redland Field, where the World Series was playable. Eddie Sicott hit Reds leadoff batter Maury Rath, which was later identified as a signal to the gamblers that the fix was underway. At the time, fans watching the game would not have understood the significance of that moment. Looking back, however, it became one of the most recognizable moments associated with the scandal. So after the World Series ended, the story began to change. What had initially been rumors and suspicions became a much more serious investigation. Sports writer Hugh Fullerton was one of the people who continued questioning the legitimacy of the series and helped keep the story in the public eye. Eventually, the investigation moved to Chicago in the Cook County Criminal Courts building, which you could see down here. This is the historic building, not the new court buildings. In September 1920, the grand jury began investigating the allegations, and Eddie Sykott and Joe Jackson testified about receiving money connected to the fix. Shortly afterward, the White Sox suspended the players who were still with the team, so it kind of gutted the team at the time. This is where the geographic story really shifts. The map moves away from baseball stadiums and hotels and into newspapers and courthouses and eventually the offices of baseball's new commissioner, which more so was the federal court building at that time, as well as the Hotel Congra Plaza, if you look at the story map. So for me, there are three major takeaways from this project. First would be the Black Sox scandal demonstrated how important public confidence was to the future of professional baseball. The problem was not simply that games may have been fixed. It raised questions about whether fans could trust the sport they were watching. Second, the scandal involved much more than 8 baseball players. Gamblers, journalists, team officials, lawyers, and baseball owners all became part of the story, as of course they created their first baseball commissioner here, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, pictured below right here. So the creation of commissioner's office and the appointment of Kennesaw Mountain Landis showed that baseball's leadership believed significant changes were necessary. Finally, I think the biggest takeaway from creating this project was seeing how geography can change the way we understand history. Following the locations allowed me to see the scandal as a series of connected events rather than one isolated incident. So overall, this was one of the projects I enjoyed most because it combined my interest in history with baseball and digital history, local history. I also like that story maps allowed me to approach the Black Sox scandal differently than I would in a traditional paper. That's what makes this class enjoyable. So that's what makes this class fun. So I look forward to looking at your guys' videos, looking at your guys' maps, and responding as well. Go ahead and follow this link down here, or you can go ahead and scan this QR code as well. Thank you all so much. God bless you, and I look forward to your responses. Bye.